Hey everyone, it's Rob, and thanks for listening in today. I greatly appreciate your time. You are going to enjoy this interview with Stephen Dinan. Now, Stephen is the founder and CEO of the Shift Network and a member of the Transformational Leadership Council and Evolutionary Leaders. The Shift Network was founded in 2010 and has served over 3.5 million people worldwide with customers in 180 countries. It delivers virtual summits, courses, and trainings featuring over 250 core faculty and 3,000 thought leaders in domains as diverse as spirituality, peace, holistic health, psychology, parenting, enlightened business, shamanism, indigenous wisdom, and sustainability. Stephen is a graduate of Stanford University in human biology and the California Institute of Integral Studies in East-West psychology. He helped create and directed the Esalen Institute's Center for Theory and Research, a think tank for leading scholars, researchers, and teachers to explore human potential frontiers. As the former director of membership and marketing at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, he was the driving force behind the Shift in Action program and the 1 Minute Shift media series. He has been a featured speaker all over the world at conferences, events, radio programs, and online summits. He is also the author of Sacred America, Sacred World, Fulfilling Our Mission in Service to All, and Radical Spirit. You are going to enjoy my chat with Stephen. It is going to give you lots to think about. Stephen, welcome to the podcast. I'm so grateful for your time. I can't tell you how excited I've been to chat with you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you here. And thank you all for your great work as well.
Of course. Thank you. Now, I always like to start with a quote. So this one goes like this. Quote, "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience, but rather spiritual beings having a human experience." And that is from, I'm going to butcher this name, but I'm going to do my best. Maybe you'll help me. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah. I had a feeling you'd say it better than I would. But what comes to your mind when you hear that quote?
Well, I think what it really comes down to is that we identify as souls that are here on a mission, first and foremost. In some ways, a lot of just the activities of being human are a little bit more like, dealing with basic human needs and making sure we can survive and do this. And we're sort of a little bit just, pinballing around this world versus like really realizing that there's a deeper intention behind why we're here. It's like we're here to have certain growthful evolutionary experiences. We might choose our family for certain purposes. We might choose where we're born for a reason because of culture, and that we're evolving our souls over time. And I think that's when we think of being a soul, that we're on a journey. This is likely not the only journey. In fact, there's, I think, the whole host of very solid research around past lives and reincarnation and everything from birthmarks to communications with the other side. There's a lot of interesting lines of evidence that point to this is a longer journey that we're on, that we have an episode in a particular lifetime, and that we might have certain intentions about what we want to learn or what we want to clear or grow or get beyond. And that creates a different context for how we engage life, and potentially how we create businesses as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about maybe going back a little bit to your youth. One thing you just mentioned was where we're born and choosing where we were born. Can you expand a little bit on what you meant by that?
Well, I think that in many ways, if we're thinking of ourselves as on a growth trajectory as souls, that we want to sort of take in certain virtues and values, and sometimes certain challenges as well. And there may be geographic aspects to that. So I was born in northern Minnesota, so we share a little bit of that trajectory. I think it's a very grounded, rooted, non-hypey culture. I mean, I joke that in California, everything is awesome, and Minnesota is like, oh, it's pretty good. It's sort of, there's a way it's sort of like more, and there's something about having to be cold a good chunk of the year and rely on the goodness of other people, and that there's a kind of a social fabric that gets built out of that is very, I think, kind and generally more respectful, and also more grounded in the rhythms of nature, that you have to sort of care for the basics more than elsewhere. Like in California, it can be a little bit easier to be kind of like shoot for the moon and grandiose and a little ungrounded about things. And so I kind of feel like my soul chose to come through a nice grounded Midwest, very nice, very solid family that, my parents were very virtuous and very civic minded, and my dad was the city attorney. My mom worked for a school district. And so I feel like they gave me a certain grounded moral and value system so that I could then go explore the world and do the California circuit and explore a lot of these frontier leading edge areas, but in a way that still kind of kept that Minnesota grounded sensibility.
Mm-hmm. When did you notice that you were consciously aware of some sort of inner wisdom? Did that happen early for you?
I was very ambitious early on. I was very competitive. I was into sports, and I really wanted to kind of move up the ladder of success. And I got in my mind, I wanted to go to Stanford when I was in 8th grade. And so I was kind of doing a lot of that stuff. And it was really more of the disillusionment phase. I had a close friend from high school who died in a car accident, and that sort of provoked a certain level of existential search or questioning, like, why am I always just running up the next hill? Why am I, what are we really here for? What's life about? And so there's many different phases of that led into different kinds of explorations. I almost dropped out of Stanford to go travel and explore the world. And I got really into just understanding the world from different perspectives, which I found travel really gave me. I also got involved, I was very judgmental of anything that had to do with religion for a long time, or spirituality. And then some friends were actually experimenting with psychedelic mushrooms, which I was very judgmental of. And then I tried them, and it opened up this whole other experience of more spiritual realities. And so there's a number of things that led me to Tibetan Buddhism and human potential things. And I started to just explore the world, explore consciousness, and move away from a more materialistic worldview that I'd had as a kind of more atheistic driven scientist type. Mm-hmm. And that really propelled me through much of my 20s on an exploration of all kinds of different human potential frontiers, from yoga. I did several years of martial arts with Aikido. I had a Jungian therapist for a while. I explored holotropic breath work, which was a breath-based way to do deep healing and access non-ordinary states of consciousness. And basically, I kind of looked at a lot of different wisdom traditions in Kabbalah, even circle back into mystical Christianity, but really sort of curious about what the leading edge pioneers of the planet had been up to in terms of actualizing something deeper and more meaningful.
I'm curious what whatever age you were, I'm just gonna, the 8-year-old that wanted to go to Stanford, which you did end up going to Stanford, so you followed through on the 8-year-old's wish. But what would the 8-year-old be thinking now, seeing you as the older you?
It was actually 8th grade, but
8th grade. I'm sorry.
At the time, I definitely probably would have been like, what a kind of out there, it's like totally foreign, because I had sort of dropped the whole religion thing. I thought this just seems like a bunch of hook'em. It's like I wasn't really into the spirit. I was into like science and studying. And so I think that, the kind of things I'm up to would have been really mysterious, frankly, to my 8th grade self at the time. Although I think that, the piece around building something that can serve large numbers of people, I think probably would resonate more. But I didn't have aspirations to go into business at all. I was much more on the kind of scientist, doctor kind of track. And I never thought of myself as a business person. My parents didn't have any real background in business or working with money. And so they didn't really encourage me in that direction. And so it's a bit, it was very emergent to be on the path to be the CEO of a company that now has 100-ish employees, and that we're sort of have customers in 280 countries, and that it's sort of like that whole aspect, because 8th grade there wasn't even really an internet at the time, so the concept of having transformational teachers delivered over the internet to customers all over the world, it would have been very weird to describe what I do right now.
It'd blow that 8th grader's mind. What you're up to.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned you've traveled a lot, and I read a bit about some of your travels, and I got curious. Were there one or two impactful trips that you had, that really helped shift the way you think as a person?
Yeah, I think I had 4 months traveling through India, mostly by myself. I had gone there with my first wife. She had a big opening in an ashram with a teacher, and she was like, got clear that that's where she's supposed to stay. So we kind of had this weird end of the marriage where she just had an opening. She's still in India. And so I ended up just wandering India for 4 months by myself. And it was a time of India can be really challenging on a lot of different levels. It's very intense on a sensory level. And it's like there's a density of humanity and in your face, and the swarms of little vehicles and, cows, and your bus is almost going off the cliffs. And there's like an intensity and overwhelm sometimes about India. But what it has is a lot of surface chaos, and then there's this kind of calm river underneath where people are in some ways much more at peace. There's sort of the joke that in India it's like they may go to bed hungry, but they sleep well through the night, whereas in the West, where we have all this creature comforts and people need sleeping pills. So it's like, and so there's a way in which India has a kind of a calmer river underneath, and a sort of a sense of a deeper connection to a wider worldview, really, than in the West. And so there's a kind of a pervasive spirituality, even while there's a lot of just craziness that happens on the surface. And I found that what that did is it kind of chiseled away at certain defense patterns I had. And so it sort of like gradually opened me to really some ecstatic and beautiful experiences where I kind of, merged into and had a more unitive experience with, all of reality, and just my energy system opening up, accessing other levels of consciousness, even while there was, it's like there was one point in which I had dysentery, and I was like literally on death's door and had to have doctors come to the hotel because I couldn't walk. And it was like, there's like the intense challenge, initiatory aspects, but then there's this kind of breaking down of a certain rigidity that led to a much deeper sense of connection to a divine dimension to life.
Mm-hmm. I have a lot of questions about all of that. When you're finding another, I'll call it a level or something like that, what does that feel like? And what are you noticing?
Another access to another level. So
level of consciousness.
Another level of consciousness. Yeah. So for me, it's like there's a little bit like, you think of the horse with the blinders on, is like a lot of times our normal everyday consciousness, we're just focusing on whatever's right in front of us, and we have a little bit of screening out of other sources of input. And so what I find is that like that kind of drops away, and then there's a sense of like that my mind intelligence isn't limited to my brain or to my local self, that it's actually kind of in a subtle way interconnected with a lot more things. So I get a lot more information more quickly, and sort of patterns, ideas, things crystallize in a different way than in an everyday state of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I get more sensitized to the flows of energy, and oftentimes I get much more intuitive. Like I can sort of track things. I'll give an example. Something that happens when I'm in a more connected space like that is like one year I got the sense that I had the message, or you were supposed to go to the Yucatan and do ceremony at New Year's with Mayan elders. And my wife was like, we don't know any Mayan elders. And so we were like, okay, well, let's just get a plane ticket and see what happens. And so 2 days before New Year's Eve, we don't even have a hotel for New Year's Eve because the whole place is booked out. And she's like, where are the Mayan elders? What's going on? And then we're on the beach and we run into this beautiful soul, Abuelo Antonio Oshte. And he's like, oh, you came. I've been sending you messages, and turned out he'd literally been sending us emails to our company, but I hadn't gotten those, but he sent me a psychic message that we were supposed to come. And that led to all kinds of really interesting things, and become an important teacher for us as well. But it had a kind of a magic to it, where it's just like little message just dropped in, and I was like, okay, I'll go with that. And so I found that in India as well, where when you're decoupled from when I'm decoupled from this more linear horse blinders on, like there's more synchronicity that happens. There's more kind of like guidance, like, oh, you really need to go this way. And you meet this person who turns out there's all this magic that can happen. And so it's like you're kind of following these little subtler impulses, and that leads oftentimes to really magical places. So I think of it as like our normal everyday consciousness gets suspended a bit, and our soul can just drop in little nuggets, very much like in the dream state, where we're getting messages in more symbolic form, but you can do it in the day-to-day, where little droplets of meaningful guidance are happening in a more regular way.
When something happens, like when you went to the Mayan elder, and he sees you on the beach, and you have this, wow. Do you say, wow, or do you say nothing? Like it just makes sense. And the reason I ask is oftentimes in the West, especially, things like that would happen, and people would say things like, oh, isn't that crazy that happened?
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm getting at is it crazy? And why do we say it's crazy if it is just what it's supposed to be?
Well, I think that there's always that kind of rush of, excitement, of like tingles, or like, whoa, I think that's just natural for it to happen. So it means there's some subliminal part of us is like not expecting that it's really going to happen. And so when something does, it's like, oh, wow. Yeah. But it also, I think, does get normalized. And I don't think of it as crazy. It's sort of like, okay, that's why I got that message. And it turned out in that particular case, we actually got to witness the passing of the baton from his elder, who was like 95 years old, didn't even speak Spanish, had like 2 teeth, but was sort of like the most, beloved prayer warrior shaman of the area. And then we ended up getting to be there on New Year's Eve, when his elder got the sense to basically empower him as the lineage holder, and that he was going to transition out and leave the planet soon. So we got to be present for this really quite extraordinary little ceremonial passing of the torch to the next generation. And that was what I guess the inner guidance was telling me we needed to be there for. So it was very validating, but sometimes, and so there is definitely a wow factor. Like, it's not like I was like, oh, of course, yeah, that's why. But it's I think it does get normalized, where you start to expect to live a little bit more in that flow state.
There are a couple of what I think are organizations that you're part of, and I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about them. One's called the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And could you share what noetic means and what that organization is all about?
Yeah, so noetic science is a really study of consciousness itself, and it was created by Edgar Mitchell, who was an astronaut, Apollo astronaut, and who had a spiritual opening on the way back. And he was a bit more of a materialist scientist at the time, but in looking at Earth from space, his consciousness expanded, and he had a really emotionally and psychologically powerful experience of like the preciousness of this planet, and the way that we're all interconnected in ways that we don't always know. And so he, as a scientist, he wanted to understand that, and understand that from a more rational standpoint, and how that kind of a worldview shift or a mystical opening could lead to a different way of being on this planet, where we take better care of it. So he created the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and it kind of became this place for studying, distant healing and psychic abilities and communicating with the other side, and a lot of the weird stuff that people are into, but they often don't get to study in mainstream universities because it's a little too far out there. But what you find is that a lot of people are interested in it, but they just feel like it's not quite socially acceptable to do it. So my wife was at one point, my current wife, who had been together for more than 20 years now, is like, she was running an organization called the Full Circle Fund, and there's all these Silicon Valley venture capitalist types, and I was sort of known as like the spiritual guy. And so they would confess all this stuff to me that they would never tell to her. They'd be like, so I had this psychic experience the other night, and they would ask me for advice on how to deal with it, or they had an out-of-body experience, and so it's like far, and she was like, no way, that guy. And so there's like this kind of secret life, and the same thing with scientists, where there's kind of secret life where they're curious about some of these areas. But then the dominant scientific discourse tends to be more dismissive, and so they keep their interest more underground. Anyway, so IONS kind of becomes like the father confessor for scientists who are interested in exploring these frontier areas. And and a lot of the scientists who get engaged there are super rigorous. I mean, some of the science that's been done around psychic abilities, for instance, is way more rigorous than in almost any other area, and it's just definitive. It's like, we have the ability, so at least some humans have the ability to communicate at a distance, and without any appreciable means of understanding that, and it's just true. And so some of these other areas too, there's a whole body of scientific information that most people don't get exposed to, that's really pretty rigorous. Like mentioned past lives before. There's a whole body of work around birthmarks and correlating those with death wounds from previous lifetimes. So kids that are 4 or 5 years old start talking about a previous lifetime. Our older girl has talked about previous lifetimes. And then they'll basically report sometimes being very specific people, and you go back and research, and then a death wound from that lifetime shows up as a birthmark in this lifetime. So how do you explain that? There's a whole body of research around that. And I could go into other areas, but if you're really open to it as a scientific inquiry, there's a lot of fascinating stuff that points to us not being localized to this body mind, that there's a part of us that travels onward into beyond this body and into other lifetimes. And that does create a different context. It connects back with the Desjardins quote at the beginning of like, we're a spiritual being having a human experience.
When you talked about the astronaut, there's a documentary called One Strange Rock by Will Smith, or he narrates it, excuse me, it's not by him, but he narrates it. And essentially they interview all these astronauts that have spent time up in space. And as they stare down at Earth, the strange rock, they start to really notice things in a different way. Their mind starts to shift. And I kept noticing shift often, by the way, as a side note, and obviously it's the name of your company, the Shift Network. And as I was doing research, shift kept popping up in my mind. But that documentary, which I think is National Geographic, I thought was so interesting to have these astronauts that are revered in our society because they've done something that's so unique to be up in space for that long. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about this mind shift that many of these astronauts have, looking down at this strange rock, and what your thoughts are.
Well, I think on the deepest level, we're moving towards a global consciousness, a more unitive global consciousness, where we're less identified as individuals and races or genders or nations, that we're really thinking of ourselves as a planetary species, as one whole, and that we learn to celebrate the differences that unite us. So I think when you look at the planet from the outside, you are automatically having, they call it the overview effect. You're looking at the whole as one unified entity, and that starts to shift your perception, rather than you're down in the matrix of the hubbub of New York City trying to kind of fight out your existence or something. You're seeing the whole, and you're seeing that it is a kind of a beautiful unified entity that we're all a part of. And so the individuals become kind of cells in a larger body, if you will, and so that there's a natural recognition of a kind of a holism that I think that comes with that. So when I think about the shift in consciousness we're going through, I think there's a lot of different dimensions to it, but one of them is moving to really seeing ourselves as a planetary species rather than as races or nations so much. Another is really thinking holistically of the different levels of ourselves and honoring those, from the physical level, the emotional level, to the thinking level, to the spiritual levels. And there's, when you have all these different religious traditions, mystical traditions, science. It's like there's a spiritual dimension to us that needs to be seen and honored, and it doesn't denigrate or marginalize any other aspect. It just gives a wider context for that. And so I think that we shift to seeing ourselves as spiritual beings, seeing ourselves more holistically, and beginning to, I think, see the divinity in all people and all things, like that there's a kind of a sacred spark within everybody that needs to be honored. And that leads to a different way of engaging people. I mean, the idea of war and violence become unthinkable the more that we're kind of grounded in that knowledge. And so that's where I think the great benefit of all these different transformative practices and traditions. And we have, many great lineages, hundreds of great lineages extending back thousands of years. And what the more enlightened individuals who emerge are really operating from a field of love, from a place of wisdom, of mutual respect and appreciation. And they're kind of our psychonauts to parallel the astronauts. They're getting to kind of emerge into a worldview and a perspective that's wiser and more whole. And then they can call other people into that, ideally, and that we can outgrow this phase of human history where so much has been guided by a strongly egoic, fear-based, and frankly self-destructive kind of operating system, and into this more holistic operating system. And so I think that's on the highest level, that's what the shift is. We're kind of outgrowing one planetary operating system, and there's a critical mass that we need to grow into this new operating system. And so, people are making that shift, generally over 5-10 years, once they become more intentional about it. And then we'll eventually reach a point where we have a critical mass of humanity, and that becomes more the default operating system than what we have right now.
As we record this today, it's February 2nd, 2022. So 2222. Do you have any thoughts about numbers at all?
I think numbers are fun to project onto. I don't know that I'm not a big numerology person or anything, but I think that if you think of all the twos, it's like we're coming back to we're spiritual beings having human experience. We are incarnated in a realm of duality. It's like that there's the hot and cold, and dark and light, and all we're experience a lot of polarity. But part of what we need to do is not to get into the destructive forms of polarity, but into those polarities creating a higher unity. So what's the opportunity for today is to embrace the dualities and sort of move them into kind of a higher unification.
How do you think the pandemic served this thought process? Was it useful in some ways?
I think it can be useful. It depends on the person. It's like I don't want to just kind of paint a broad brushstroke that was all perfectly unfolded.
That's fair.
In a way, but it's sort of like, I think that there's a way in which, if we have learned the lessons of the last 2 years, it can mature us as a species. We've learned to work more collaboratively internationally. I mean, the level of scientific and health collaboration on a planetary level is really unprecedented in the speed at which we did it. I think there are aspects of being able to kind of balance self and whole, like where we are, even people who weren't necessarily concerned about getting COVID for themselves, but choosing to mask and participate in all the protection for the good of the commons. I think that there's a good set of lessons in that. I think there's also some paradigm shifts in how we do reality. It's like the pivot towards more remote work and location independent work, so people can really root into the planet where they feel most aligned, rather than having to chase jobs in cities. They can kind of find their place where they're really at their best and optimize their place. We've just got back from Mexico, where we spent 5 weeks, and we bought a place down there, and we're planning to spend more like several months a year in Mexico, and really think of ourselves more as like bicultural in certain ways, even though my Spanish is not that great yet. But it's sort of like we want our girls to grow up, or we have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. We want our girls to grow up with that sense of more globalized bicultural identity. And there's a sort of a whole different matrix of blessings and virtues from Mexican culture that I feel like is kind of an antidote to some of the imbalances in American culture as well. So it's not just the physical beauty or the beach. It's really, there's a it's almost a different kind of medicine for the soul.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so it's like, if we're sort of seeing ourselves as like living part of the year in Mexico and part of the year here, that's part of what the pandemic has allowed. Without the pandemic, we still would have been stuck in, like, we have to meet in physical spaces. Therefore, it's like, to run this company, I have to be in this location because that's where the management team is and our offices, and letting all that go allowed us to sort of tune into what's actually best for my soul and my body, my family, my service. And it allows us to be more creative. And I think that may be one of the most enduring gifts of the pandemic, that it's allowed us to find our way into a pattern of life that's more aligned with what is really best for us. And I think that, Shift, we've really embraced that as a company. And I think the companies that are embracing that are really going to be the ones that thrive. No, you can't do it for everything. You have to manufacture things. There's people in restaurants. You can't do location independence for everything, but there's going to be more and more people, I think, who embrace working from where you feel most at home, where you feel most fed, and that gives you a different ground from which to serve. And the companies can optimize for that too. So.
Well, let me ask you about this other organization that I was reading about, the Transformational Leadership Council on Evolutionary Leaders. Can you explain a bit about that organization?
Great. So there's actually two different ones. There's
they're separate. Okay.
And evolutionary leaders. So Transformational Leadership Council was started by Jack Canfield and a number of other people. It's tended to come out of more people who are really deep on a path of personal growth, and we're particularly focused more on authors and speakers within companies and change agents within companies. I'd say the evolutionary leaders group has tended to be a little bit more social minded, like social evolution, like it's not just about the personal change, but a little bit more about systemic or planetary change. But both have been magnets for people who are interested in fueling positive movements for change in the world by our own personal transformation. And so who have a deep commitment to that. So the TLC sort of more share skills, practices, insights, and in many ways, evolutionary leaders spend a little bit more time on, like, how do we make collective contribution? And so, but in each of their own ways, it's sort of a network of leaders, each of whom has influence, and oftentimes over many, many people. And so by synergizing with other people who have that kind of influence, then it sort of helps us take our own work to the next level. There's a little bit more accountability, and there's also a sense of, like, sometimes being able to catapult different initiatives forward that can really be valuable.
And are the leaders, are they generally in business, or are they leaders from all sorts of organizations? Could be nonprofit, could be government, or
yeah, TLC is more on the business side, not exclusively, but mostly on the business side. And then evolutionary leaders more general, probably more nonprofit in general there.
What do you feel like is in the way of us becoming more aware of our inner wisdom as a society?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that part of the thesis of the Shift Network is that the most important thing we can do is expose ourselves regularly to wiser people. And so by making classes, workshops, distance learning, media, making it more available so you can kind of have more wisdom at your fingertips, it tends to elicit more of your own inner wisdom. There's the whole old saying that we become more like the 5 people that we spend the most time around. So if you spend more time around wiser people, that elicits more wisdom from you. So I think that there's a wisdom in just noticing where we spend our time, and are we spending time with people who largely reinforce the kind of old systems, old perspectives that have their value, and or do we spend time with people who are creative or innovative, leading edge, who are doing spiritual practices, and they will tend to kind of pull us in that direction. And so I think that's one area is being attentive to how we spend our time. Like spending 4 hours with mainstream television a day is not doing most people a whole lot of good. But it's not that TV doesn't have its upside, or movies. Movies can be incredibly liberating. We just did a Shift Film Festival, which is all about movies that can really change our world by changing our consciousness. So I think that media has an incredible power to transform, but so much of media is really kind of reinforcing old habits of mind and being. So I think we have to be more judicious about how we spend our attention and focus, and put more of that into things that are helping us, inspire us, to grow us. It can be cultural, it can be travel, it can be through media, it can be through the kinds of friendships we make, through the kind of conferences or events we go to, but just what we feed into the system is going to help us evolve. And so I think we're a little, as a culture, a bit too addicted to some of the dramas of the old rather than the emergence of the new.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a value system that has maybe over prioritized work and productivity to like a level where there's not as much time being invested in growing yourself. It's something that we haven't committed to publicly yet, but we've been in a little more active exploration about, should we move towards a 4-day work week? Should we already on Fridays, we try not to have any meetings on Fridays. We try to reinforce this is your day to catch up, invest in your own growth, explore a bit more. So we're trying not to kind of pile on more work on Fridays, but give that as more your time to dilate, to open, to expand. And I think something like that rhythm is where business is headed, where there's a bit more of a balance between the output and productivity and the inner cultivation. So structurally, it's like, 50, 60, 70-hour work weeks don't work very well to grow yourself, to have the time to grow yourself in different ways. And so some level of work-life balance. Now, and then I think once you're on the job, also, what we've really tried to do is create a culture where people can be themselves, that they can be really, we have a weekly staff meeting where we often have breakout groups and really just have people share heartfully about what's going on in their lives. Because if there's less separation from your private self and your public self, that means that it's easier in your public role to be bringing more of yourself forward, and you grow more, because one of the biggest barriers to growth is inauthenticity. So if you're being inauthentic, you can't really grow because you're not being yourself anyway. And so the more authentic you can be in how you engage your work, the more I think work is a spiritual practice and a vehicle for growth. And then making sure that we honor and prioritize those aspects of work that may not be as immediate bottom line productivity oriented right now, but might grow us for the long haul. One of the things I was just working last week on a more formalized compensation philosophy, just so people would understand the logic behind the different kinds of compensation. And one of the first principles I really thought about was just like that our goal is to incentivize long-term thinking. And that's for the company, but it's also for the individual, because so much of our business systems have been built around kind of short-term carrots, like, oh, here, we'll pay you a little, give you a bonus, we'll do this if you just do X, Y, and Z, or here's our quarterly, if you make this quarterly number, we're going to drive your stock price up. So there's a lot of short-term forces that are kind of incentivizing people to make sugar rush kinds of decisions. It's like, get a little sugar rush and you get more money for that. And I think those things, when you compound them up to the level of systems, economic systems, all that short-term thinking is part of what's undermining the health of our world. And so can we unwind that and incentivize people primarily with long-term thinking? So as an example, we're actually consciously pay a little below market rate. And the reason for that is if we're having to pay market rate, it means we have to generally make the same decisions that other people are making in order to drive enough revenues to pay the people at that market rate. And then but then on the other side, we get people who are a lot more generous on other benefits, and then more generous on stock option interest, which is incentivizing people to think more like long-term owners. So you kind of balance out a little bit the short-termism with the